Hey everyone, I'm in need of some advice and maybe a bit of a place to vent. I'm not usually the type to put my personal life on the internet, but I feel like I'm at my breaking point, and I don't have anyone in my circle I feel comfortable talking to about this. I guess, deep down, my wife, Jenny, and I have been together for 9 years and married for 6. We met in college, where I was working on my computer science degree and she was pursuing a marketing degree. Things were great back then. We had a lot of fun, shared big dreams, and had this unshakable trust in each other. We moved into a small apartment together right after college, got married 2 years later, and eventually moved into a little house that we both loved. Life felt like it was moving in the direction I'd always wanted. She's a marketing manager now, and I work as a web designer. It's not always glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I actually enjoy. For the longest time, I thought we had a solid marriage. Sure, we had our ups and downs like any couple, but I always felt like we were in it together, you know? That was until a few months ago when things started feeling off. At first, I brushed it off as just work stress or maybe a rough patch. But things kept building, and before I knew it, the doubts that I'd been pushing away started creeping into my mind at all hours. The first sign? She started coming home late more often. I'd ask about her day, but her answers got vague. Just work stuff. Meetings running late, the usual. There was this constant, nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that I tried. But the doubts only got worse. It was on one of those rare nights when we went out together that things took an unexpected turn. We'd been to a few places, but she insisted on this trendy bar across town that I'd never heard of. It wasn't exactly my scene, but I figured it was good to try new things. As we walked in, I noticed her demeanor change. She seemed almost excited, a little too enthusiastic for what was supposed to be a date night with me. It was there that I noticed her looking at the bartender a little too often. I tried to shake off the weird vibe, telling myself I was just imagining things. But I couldn't ignore the way she glanced over at him whenever she thought I wasn't looking. He was this younger guy, good-looking and clearly enjoying her attention. At one point, she even went to order us drinks and ended up chatting with him at the bar longer than seemed necessary. That night, I lay awake replaying everything in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. And that's when the first cracks started to show in our marriage. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a nightmare I never saw. After that night at the bar, things only got stranger. Jenny kept finding reasons to go out with her work friends or blow off some steam after a tough day. Now, I'm not the type to keep my wife on a leash. If she needed time to relax or hang out with friends, I'd encourage her to have fun. But it wasn't just the frequency. It was the shift in her attitude. One Friday night, she came home well after midnight, smelling faintly of whiskey and some cologne that definitely wasn't mine. I tried not to make a big deal of it, but when I asked her how the night went, she just mumbled a quick "fine" and headed straight to the shower. I was left sitting there, feeling like some stranger in my own home, wondering what had happened to the Jenny who used to tell me every detail of her day. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself I was overthinking things. But then I noticed she was putting more effort into her appearance, especially on those nights out. She'd be in front of the mirror for what felt like hours, putting on makeup, choosing a dress, fixing her hair, all for a casual hangout with coworkers. It didn't sit right. She'd tell me, "I just want to feel good about myself," or, "You know how it is, it's just the girls tonight." But there was something guarded in her tone, like she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear. I figured maybe I'd start showing her more attention, try to bring the spark back between us. So, I planned a nice date night. I made a reservation at this restaurant she'd been talking about, and I put on my best effort to make her feel special. She seemed to appreciate it, or at least she played along for the night. But even when we were out, her phone was buzzing nonstop. She'd glance at it, and her face would light up in a way that stung a little. When I asked who it was, she just said, "Oh, it's nothing. Just work stuff." But she laughed, and it was that same laugh she used to give me when we were first dating. Only now, it was aimed at her phone screen. That night, I felt this creeping sense of dread. Something wasn't right, but I kept telling myself I was imagining things. But I was tired of second-guessing myself, and the more I tried to ignore it, the louder those doubts got. I started to question every little thing. I'd catch her in small lies, little details that didn't quite add up. She'd say she was at one place, but a mutual friend would mention seeing her somewhere else entirely. One weekend, she told me she was going on a girls' trip with some old friends from college. I wasn't thrilled about her going, especially considering how strange things had been between us lately, but I didn't want to be the possessive husband who kept her from living her life. She left that Friday morning, all smiles and excitement, and I tried to play it cool. I even convinced myself that maybe the trip would give us both some space and help us reconnect. But the entire weekend, I felt this awful pit in my stomach, like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She barely texted, and when I tried calling to see how things were going, it would go straight to voicemail, or she'd respond hours later with a quick, "We're having fun, don't worry." On Sunday night, she came back looking relaxed but almost distant, like she'd returned from some other world I didn't belong to. She didn't offer up any stories about the trip, no funny memories with her friends like she usually did. When I asked her how it was, she shrugged and said, "It was nice, just some good time with the girls." But something felt wrong, and I couldn't shake it. That's when I realized I was no longer living in the same marriage I thought I had. A few days after she got back from that so-called girls' trip, I finally reached my breaking point. I couldn't take the paranoia anymore. I hated myself for even considering snooping on her, but at that point, I felt like I had no other choice. I had to know what was going on, even if I wasn't sure I'd like the answer. So, one night after she fell asleep, I took her phone from her side of the bed. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. Thankfully, I knew her passcode. I hated myself for doing this, but the nagging feeling inside me was stronger than my guilt. I went straight to her messages, and at first, everything seemed normal. She had text from her sisters, her mom, a couple of friends. But then, I stumbled upon a name I didn't recognize. Ryan? Ryan. Just a simple name, and yet seeing it there felt like a punch to the gut. I opened the conversation, and that's when my whole world came crashing down. The messages were intimate. There was flirting, inside jokes, things I'd never heard her say to anyone. My heart was pounding as I scrolled through weeks of messages that made it all too clear this wasn't some harmless friendship. Turns out, Ryan was a bartender she'd met that night we went out together. The same guy I'd caught her eyeing across the bar. As I read through the messages, I saw everything laid out in black and white. She'd been texting him constantly, meeting up with him after work, even seeing him during that girls' trip she'd lied about. She told him things like, "I can't wait to see you," and "last night was amazing." They even joked about me, calling me clueless and too busy with my own stuff to notice anything. It was like a knife to my heart every time I read one of their messages. The worst part? She wasn't just having sex with him. She was emotionally involved. She talked to him like he was her confidant, the person she could be herself with. She'd never spoken to me that way in years. I felt like I was reading the thoughts of a stranger, not my wife. I sat there in the dark, staring at my own wife's betrayal in front of me, feeling a wave of emotions that I can't even fully explain. Shock, anger, heartbreak, humiliation. I put her phone back on the nightstand and lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd ended up here. The woman lying next to me, the woman I'd loved and trusted with every fiber of my being, had been lying to me for months, sneaking around with some bartender like I was nothing to her. At that moment, I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal itself, or the fact that she thought so little of me that she didn't even bother trying to hide it better. I realized that everything I'd felt these past few months, the distance, the lies, the secrecy, had all been leading up to this. And now that I knew the truth, I had no idea what to do with it. The next morning, I could barely look at her. I was angry, hurt, and exhausted, but I knew I couldn't just let it sit. I had to confront her. So, I waited until she got home from work that evening, keeping myself busy with mundane tasks around the house just to keep my mind from spiraling. When she walked in, I told her we needed to talk, and she gave me this look a little wary, like she knew something was coming. We sat down at the kitchen table, and for a moment, I couldn't even get the words out. I just stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the person who had been sneaking around behind my back. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "Who's Ryan?" Her face went pale. She stammered, "What are you talking about?" She tried to play dumb, but the panic in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Don't lie to me, Jenny. I know about him. I saw the messages. I kept my voice steady, but inside, I was seething. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but somehow, I managed to keep it together. Her first instinct was to deny everything, of course. She tried to brush it off, saying he was just a friend, and that I was reading too much into things. But I wasn't buying it. I looked her straight in the eye and asked, "Do you think I'm an idiot? You were telling him you can't wait to see him. That last night was amazing. You went to see him during that girl's trip you lied about. Are you really going to sit there and deny it?" That's when the excuses started pouring out. She tried to blame me, saying things like, "You're always so busy with work," or "You never pay attention to me like you used to." It was like she was trying to make it seem like I was the reason she'd gone behind my back. I couldn't believe the audacity. "You think this is my fault?" I asked, barely able to contain my anger. "You think sneaking around with some bartender is justified because you're bored? Because I didn't roll out a red carpet for you every day?" She looked down, probably realizing how ridiculous her excuses sounded, but she still wouldn't take responsibility. She tried to shift the blame again, saying it just happened, and that she didn't mean for it to go this far. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Didn't mean for it to go this far? I repeated, my voice shaking. "Jenny, you lied to me for months. You went out of your way to meet up with him, to text him all hours of the day. That's not something that just happens. You chose this." She started crying, telling me she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake, that she didn't want to lose me. But I couldn't even look at her. Her apologies felt empty, like she was just saying what she thought I wanted to hear. I knew she wasn't sorry for what she did. She was only sorry she got caught. When she reached out to touch my hand, I pulled back. The last thing I wanted was to feel her touch. She looked hurt, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I just sat there, staring at the table, while she kept trying to come up with excuses, explanations, anything to soften the blow. But there was nothing she could say that would make this right. Finally, I told her, "I need some time to think." And without waiting for her to respond, I got up and left the room. I didn't want to be near her, didn't want to hear another excuse, another fake apology. I needed space, and I needed to figure out what I was going to do next. After that confrontation, I felt like I was living in some twisted version of my own life. It was as if the walls of our house, the same ones that once felt like a sanctuary, were closing in on me, reminding me of everything she'd done. Every corner seemed to echo with memories of us that now felt tainted, poisoned by her lies and betrayal. I spent the next few days trying to wrap my head around it all, replaying every moment in my mind, every subtle change in her behavior, every time she dismissed me with a quick excuse. All those little red flags I'd brushed off, they were clear as day now. I trusted her so completely that I'd ignored all the signs staring me right in the face. The anger was the worst part. It was like this constant burn inside me that I couldn't shake, no matter what I did. I tried distracting myself with work, but the minute I stopped, it was there, gnawing at me. The anger was joined by something even worse, this deep, hollow sadness. This was the woman I'd given my heart to, the woman I'd planned a future with, and she'd thrown it all away for some fling with a bartender. The most twisted part? I still loved her. Despite everything she'd done, despite the lies, the betrayal, the broken trust, there was a part of me that still wanted to hold on to the life we'd built together. I hated myself for it. I felt weak, like I was betraying my own self-respect by even considering the idea of forgiving her. Jenny kept trying to talk to me, pleading with me to give us another chance and move past this. She promised me that it was over with Ryan, that she'd cut all ties with him, that she'd never do anything like this again. She kept saying she was sorry, but it felt hollow. I could tell she wanted to sweep this whole mess under the rug and pretend it had never happened. But there was no going back for me. Things couldn't be that simple. Every time I looked at her, I saw the messages she'd sent to him, the way she laughed about me with him, the nights she'd snuck off under the guise of girls' night. Her words didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. She'd shown me who she really was, and I couldn't unsee it. One evening, after another painful conversation, I took a walk just to clear my head. I wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood, letting the cool air hit my face as I tried to process everything. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a house that felt more like a prison with every passing day. I knew I had a choice to make, and either option felt impossible. When I finally returned home, I found her sitting in the living room, looking up at me with those big, tear-streaked eyes, waiting for me to say something. She wanted a decision. But how could I make one when I was still so torn between the love I once felt for her and the deep betrayal that had shattered it? After that walk, I knew I couldn't keep dragging this out. Every day was like a fresh wound, and I couldn't heal if I kept lingering in this state of indecision. I spent another sleepless night lying next to her, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. By the time the sun came up, I'd made up my mind. I had to decide, one way or another, what my future would look like, with her or without her. That morning, I told her we needed to sit down and talk, for real this time. She looked nervous, but I could see a flicker of hope in her eyes, like maybe this was her chance to convince me that we could still make it work. But I wasn't there to be convinced. I was there to be heard. "I need you to listen," I started, and I could see her tense up. "I need you to hear what this has done to me. I need you to understand the pain you've caused." She nodded, biting her lip, waiting for me to go on. "I trusted you more than anyone else in this world. I thought we were a team, that no matter what happened, we'd always be honest with each other. But you broke that. You lied to my face, you laughed about me with him, and you made me feel like a fool in my own marriage." My voice cracked, and I could see her face fall, but I didn't stop. "I don't know if I can ever get that trust back, Jenny. I don't know if I can look at you and not think of everything you did with him, all the lies you told me. I feel like the life we had together, everything we built, was just an illusion." She was crying by this point, but I didn't care. This was my moment to be honest, to lay it all out. "You say you're sorry, and maybe you are, but I don't think you understand how deeply this has cut me. It's not just about the affair. It's about the disrespect, the dishonesty, the way you put him above me." I took a deep breath, knowing this next part was going to hurt, but it had to be said. "I don't think I can move forward with you, Jenny. I don't know if I even want to try. I deserve someone who respects me, who's loyal, who doesn't need to seek excitement behind my back. And right now, I don't see that person in you." She broke down, sobbing, pleading with me to reconsider. She promised again that she'd cut him out of her life, that she'd go to therapy, that she'd do anything to win back my trust. But I couldn't bring myself to believe her. I couldn't unsee the things I'd seen, unhear the words she'd said to him. As much as I wished I could turn back time, that I could erase all of this, I knew that wasn't possible. For the first time in our marriage, I felt a sense of finality. I knew that staying together would only drag out the pain, that trying to rebuild would be like patching up a broken mirror. The pieces might hold, but the cracks would always be there, visible and raw. After what felt like hours of back and forth, I stood up, leaving her sitting there with her head in her hands. I went to the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and started packing. I knew I needed space, time to heal, to figure out who I was outside of this broken relationship. As I walked out the door, her voice followed me, broken and desperate, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was painful, yes, but it was also freeing. Walking out of that house, suitcase in hand, felt surreal. The life I'd known, the marriage I'd invested years into, was behind me. It wasn't the clean break I'd hoped for, though. The reality of it all started hitting me the moment I got in the car and sat there in silence, gripping the steering wheel, not even sure where I was going. It was like my mind went blank, numb from the weight of it all. I ended up driving around aimlessly, letting the miles pile up as I tried to process what had just happened. Part of me was still in shock. Jenny and I had built a life together, a house, memories, routines. I was used to her being part of every little thing in my day-to-day, and now, suddenly, it felt like I'd left a huge part of myself back in that house. Despite everything, a part of me wanted to turn around, walk back inside, and pretend none of this had happened. But I knew that going back would only prolong the pain. The truth was ugly. But at least it was out there, and I couldn't unlearn it. I had to accept that the marriage I thought we had was gone, replaced by a version of her that I didn't even recognize. I ended up at a friend's place that night. I hadn't talked to him in months, but he didn't ask questions when I showed up at his door looking like I'd just been through hell. I managed to give him the brief version: Jenny cheated, and that was enough. He offered me a place to crash, and I accepted without hesitation. Those first few days were rough. The reality of being alone started to sink in, and the weight of everything hit me hard. I'd be lying if I said I didn't second-guess myself, wondering if I should have tried harder, if maybe I'd been too quick to walk away. But every time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself of all the lies, all the disrespect, and I knew that staying with her would only hurt me more in the long run. Jenny texted me nonstop during those days. She apologized, begged me to come back, promised she'd do anything to fix things. She kept saying she'd change, that this had been a wake-up call, that she was willing to go to therapy and do whatever it took to prove she was sorry. But every message felt like a reminder of the betrayal. No apology could undo the damage or bring back the trust she'd shattered. The weird part was how empty I felt. You'd think that after walking away from a marriage, I'd feel something: anger, sadness, relief, but it was just emptiness. I think I'd spent so long being hurt, so long doubting myself and questioning everything, that now that I had my answer, I didn't know how to feel. On the third day, I finally called my parents and told them what had happened. They'd always loved Jenny and thought we were perfect together, so explaining everything was tough. My mom was supportive, but I could tell she was heartbroken. My dad, on the other hand, was furious. He couldn't understand why anyone would throw away a marriage over some cheap fling. It felt good to have their support, but it also reminded me of how much had been lost. In the end, I knew I had to start thinking about my future, about what life would look like without Jenny in it. It was terrifying, but it was also the first time in a while that I'd felt a glimmer of hope. There was a path forward, even if it was unclear and lonely. After the initial shock started to fade, I realized that the only way forward was to start rebuilding my life. It felt strange, like learning to walk again after being injured. I'd spent so much of myself on that marriage that I wasn't sure who I was outside of it. I decided to take some time off work. Thankfully, my boss was understanding, and I managed to get a couple of weeks to clear my head. I knew I needed the break. My mind was all over the place, and trying to focus on web design projects felt impossible. I used to be proud of my work, but now everything felt like an uphill battle. It was as if everything in my life was under a fog I couldn't shake. During this time, I stayed at my friend's place. He'd been a rock through all of it, letting me vent, offering advice when I needed it, and backing off when I just needed to be alone. Having someone there, even if we didn't talk much, was a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. There were nights I'd just sit there, staring into space, and he'd hand me a beer and sit next to me in silence. It was like he knew words weren't going to make it better. As the days went by, I slowly started picking up the pieces. I went back to my own place to get some of my things and realized that Jenny had left a note for me on the kitchen counter. She wrote pages and pages, apologizing, saying she understood why I'd left, and begging me to reconsider. She went on about how she missed me, how she couldn't imagine her life without me, and how she was willing to go to therapy, quit her job, anything to win me back. Reading that note brought back the anger. Here she was, acting like she was the victim, as if her choices hadn't led us to this point. The nerve she had, expecting me to just forgive and forget, only made me feel stronger in my decision. I wasn't going to be manipulated into staying with someone who clearly didn't respect me or our marriage. I put the note in the trash, feeling a small sense of closure as I did. Over the next few days, I forced myself to start thinking practically. I knew I had to figure out the logistics of a separation, moving out, dividing up our belongings, planning for the inevitable conversations about finances. It all felt overwhelming, but it was a necessary part of moving forward. I reached out to a lawyer to get advice, feeling both scared and relieved as I took that step. Part of me still wished this wasn't happening, but a bigger part knew it was the only way I'd ever find peace. Jenny continued reaching out: calls, texts, even emails. She'd alternate between apologizing and begging for another chance, then getting angry when I wouldn't respond. She said I was giving up on us too easily, that I was overreacting. It was almost laughable, considering what she'd done, but it only made it clearer that we were done. I knew I couldn't let myself be pulled back in, no matter how much she tried to twist things. As hard as it was, I started focusing on myself, doing small things to take care of my own needs. I reconnected with some old friends, people I'd lost touch with over the years. I started going to the gym again, finding that the physical exertion helped to burn off some of the anger and frustration. Little by little, I started feeling like a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't easy, and every day felt like a struggle, but for the first time in a long time, I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. There was a life waiting for me beyond this mess. A life where I could be true to myself and rebuild without the weight of lies dragging me down. It was strange getting used to being alone. At first, the quiet was uncomfortable. I'd get home and automatically reach for my phone, about to text Jenny out of habit, before realizing I had no reason to anymore. The emptiness was hard to face, but I gradually found ways to fill it with things that mattered to me. I threw myself into my work more than ever. Getting back to my projects helped me regain a sense of control and purpose. Designing websites had always been an escape for me, a place where I could create something from scratch and see the results of my efforts. Now, it became a kind of therapy. Each site I worked on, each new design, was a small reminder that I still had the ability to build, to move forward, and to create things that made sense. One night, while I was working late on a big project, my friend convinced me to take a break and go out for a drink. I hesitated. The thought of being back in a bar brought back memories of that night Jenny had met Ryan. But I knew I couldn't let her actions keep me from enjoying my life. So, I went. At the bar, I felt strange at first, a bit out of place. But after a couple of drinks, I started to relax. I chatted with people, laughed at a few jokes, and, for the first time since everything went down, I genuinely enjoyed myself. It was a relief to realize I didn't need her to have a good time. I could find my own happiness, my own moments of peace. The night out reminded me that I still had a life ahead of me. I'd let myself fall into a routine with Jenny, assuming that was the only way to be happy. But now, I had the freedom to rediscover myself, to figure out who I was outside of our relationship. And as hard as it was, that freedom felt like a gift. In the weeks that followed, I started doing things I hadn't done in years. I signed up for a photography class I'd always wanted to take, went hiking with friends, and even tried out some cooking recipes that had been sitting in the back of my mind. Each new experience was a step away from the pain she'd left behind and a step closer to finding myself again. Of course, it wasn't all easy. There were days when I'd still wake up with that gnawing feeling in my stomach, that dull ache that reminded me of what had happened. And every now and then, she'd still try to reach out, leaving messages or calling to see if I'd changed my mind. But each time, it got a little easier to ignore her, to remember that I was moving forward for myself, not for her. Looking back, I realized I'd spent so much of our marriage compromising, giving up pieces of myself to make things work. Now, I had the chance to reclaim those pieces, to live on my own terms, and it was liberating. I wasn't fully healed, not by a long shot, but I was getting there, one step at a time. As I settled into my new routine, things started to feel almost normal. I was reconnecting with friends, pursuing interests I'd put on the back burner, and focusing on my own growth. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was on solid ground. Then, just when I thought I was starting to move on, life threw me a curveball. It happened one evening when I decided to grab a coffee after work. I went to this small cafe that had become a sort of refuge for me, a quiet place where I could relax and unwind. I was just waiting in line when, out of nowhere, I heard a familiar voice. My heart skipped a beat as I turned and saw Jenny standing there, ordering her coffee. She hadn't noticed me yet, and for a moment, I considered slipping out before she did. But something kept me rooted in place. When she finally turned and saw me, her face froze. For a second, we both just stood there, staring at each other in awkward silence. It was the first time we'd seen each other in weeks, and the tension was palpable. Finally, she gave me a small, hesitant smile and approached me, holding her coffee like a shield. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, almost nervous. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, Well, I didn't expect to see you either, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. I could feel a mix of emotions bubbling up: anger, sadness, and a strange sense of nostalgia. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at her cup. Can we sit and talk for a bit? Just catch up? She looked vulnerable, and I could tell she wasn't sure how I'd respond. Part of me wanted to walk away, to keep the distance I'd worked so hard to create. But another part of me was curious. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I just wanted to hear what she had to say. After a brief hesitation, I nodded, and we found a small table near the back. The conversation started awkwardly. She asked about work, about my friends, and I gave short, polite answers, not really interested in giving her details. But eventually, she got to the real reason she wanted to talk. I know I messed up, she said quietly, her gaze focused on her coffee cup. I know I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand. And I know there's nothing I can say to make it right, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. I looked at her, feeling a strange sense of detachment. I'd imagined this moment so many times, her admitting she was wrong, apologizing, begging for forgiveness. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel like the relief I'd expected. Instead, it felt empty. Her words were too late, too shallow, like an afterthought to all the pain she'd caused. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Jenny, I appreciate the apology, but I think we're way past that now. I'm not angry anymore. Honestly, I'm just done. She looked hurt, but I didn't soften my stance. This was my chance to finally lay it all out, to say everything I'd been holding back. You made your choices, and I've had to deal with the fallout. I've moved on, or at least I'm trying to, and I think you need to do the same. I can't keep carrying the weight of your guilt. It's time for us to let go. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes, and for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. Saying those words, setting that boundary, was liberating. I could tell she was hoping for more, that maybe a part of her still wanted to fix things. But I knew it was over, and it felt like the final piece of closure I needed. After a few more minutes of small talk, we said our goodbyes. She left the cafe first, and I watched her walk away, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. It was the end of a chapter, a clean break that left me with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt before. I finished my coffee, realizing that I could finally start looking forward without the weight of the past holding me back. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it. After that unexpected meeting with Jenny, I felt a surprising sense of peace. For so long, I'd been carrying around a mix of anger, sadness, and resentment, but confronting her and setting things straight left me with a lighter heart. It was like I'd finally closed a door that had been cracked open for too long. I went back to my friend's place that night, and when he asked how my day went, I found myself actually smiling as I told him about the encounter. It felt like I'd finally reclaimed something, like I was in control of my life again instead of being a prisoner to the past. The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful changes. I decided to put more effort into creating a space that felt like mine. I started renting a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it had big windows that let in a lot of natural light and a little balcony where I could have my morning coffee. Decorating the place felt like a fresh start, and every picture frame, piece of furniture, or plant I picked out added a little piece of me to this new life. Getting used to this new rhythm wasn't easy, of course. I still had moments where I'd remember something about our life together. A song on the radio, a meal I'd cooked 100 times for us, a movie we used to love. Those memories would hit me unexpectedly, bringing with them a pang of nostalgia. But now, instead of feeling like an open wound, they felt more like scars, reminders of a time that had shaped me, but no longer held me captive. I threw myself back into my work, and it wasn't long before I got a new project that reignited my passion for design. It was a big account, a local business that wanted a complete revamp of their online presence. I took it on as a challenge, pouring hours into every detail. With each new design, I felt a growing sense of accomplishment and purpose, like I was proving to myself that I could thrive without the life I once knew. Around this time, I also started opening up to people in a way I hadn't before. I reconnected with friends, both old and new, and allowed myself to be more vulnerable with them about what I'd gone through. Some were shocked when they heard about the affair, while others shared their own stories of heartbreak and resilience. Knowing that others had gone through similar experiences made me feel less alone, and the support from these friendships became an unexpected source of strength. One evening, a friend suggested I try online dating just to see what's out there without any pressure. At first, I laughed it off, thinking I wasn't ready for anything serious. But as the days went by, I figured there was no harm in meeting new people, even if it was just to socialize and get out of my comfort zone. Setting up a profile felt strange, awkward, even. But once I did, I found that meeting new people didn't have to be complicated or loaded with expectations. I went on a couple of casual dates, enjoyed some interesting conversations, and even made a few new friends along the way. Each encounter reminded me that there was a world beyond my marriage, filled with people who valued honesty and kindness, who weren't looking to play games or hide secrets. For the first time, I felt hopeful about the future. I wasn't in a rush to find someone new or start another relationship, but knowing I was open to the possibilities was enough. I was finally learning to be content on my own, to appreciate the strength I'd found within myself. Over the next few months, life began to settle into a rhythm I actually enjoyed. My new apartment felt more like home every day, and each corner reflected something about who I was becoming. I started to take pride in the little things, cooking for myself, keeping the place organized, even learning a few new hobbies, like photography. These were things I'd always wanted to do, but somehow never made time for before. The online dating experiment continued, but I kept it light and low-key. I met a handful of new people, some who shared my interests and others who just enjoyed good conversation. Each experience taught me a little more about myself, what I was looking for, and what I valued. And while nothing serious came of these dates, they reminded me that I could find connection and companionship without rushing back into a committed relationship. One night, while out with some friends, I met someone unexpected. Her name was Sarah, and she had this warmth and easygoing energy that drew people to her. We started talking, and I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in ages. She was genuine, down to earth, and refreshingly honest. A complete contrast to the guarded, secretive person Jenny had become toward the end of our marriage. Sarah and I hit it off, and we ended up exchanging numbers before the night was over. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I was cautious about moving too fast, and I wasn't sure if I was even ready for anything serious. But over the next few weeks, we texted and met up a few times for coffee and hikes, just as friends. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people getting to know each other. What surprised me was how easy it was to talk to her. With Jenny, there had always been this underlying tension, especially toward the end. But with Sarah, everything felt natural. She'd ask me about my work, my hobbies, my goals, and I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't in years. And as the weeks turned into months, I realized that I was genuinely happy. Not the kind of forced happiness you wear as a mask, but the kind that sneaks up on you, reminding you that life can be good again. One evening, after a particularly good hike, Sarah and I sat at the top of a hill, watching the sun set over the city. She looked over at me and said, "You know, you seem like someone who's been through a lot, but you don't let it define you." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I just sat there, taking it in. "I think I'm learning not to," I replied. And for the first time, I felt like it was true. I wasn't defined by the pain, the betrayal, or the heartbreak anymore. I was starting to see myself as someone who had faced something difficult and come out stronger on the other side. Being around Sarah reminded me that I could trust again, that not everyone was out to hurt or deceive. But even more importantly, it reminded me that I could find happiness and fulfillment on my own terms. I didn't need a relationship to complete me. I just needed people in my life who added to it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized that this was the life I wanted, a life where I was free, where I chose my own happiness, and where I surrounded myself with people who valued honesty and kindness. The pain of the past would always be a part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I was finally moving forward. With each passing day, I felt more like myself, or maybe even a version of myself I hadn't known before. After years of defining my life around my relationship with Jenny, I was rediscovering who I was outside of it. My relationship with Sarah remained casual and easygoing, but more than that, it was a friendship built on genuine connection. Knowing someone could see me for who I was, without judgment or expectation, gave me the confidence to keep moving forward. My career took on a new meaning as well. I poured myself into my work with a renewed focus, finding satisfaction in creating things that resonated with clients. As I took on new projects, I started exploring new ideas, pushing my creative boundaries, and letting my work reflect the changes happening within me. It wasn't just about designing websites anymore. It was about expressing myself, putting my heart into something that was mine alone. One day, I decided to check on an old photo album that I'd boxed away during the move. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face the memories captured in those photos. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized that those moments were a part of my story, too. They weren't tainted by what had happened. They were simply pieces of my life, snapshots of a time when things were different. I found myself feeling grateful for the experiences, even if they'd ended painfully. They'd brought me here, to this new place of self-discovery, and I could finally appreciate them without letting them haunt me. Around this time, I started getting back into photography, a hobby I'd left behind after college. I dusted off my old camera, went to a few scenic spots, and began capturing moments that felt meaningful. Photography became another way for me to see the world with fresh eyes, to appreciate the beauty in the present moment without being pulled back into the past. It was like I was telling my own story through each shot, each frame capturing a new piece of who I was becoming. One evening, as Sarah and I walked around the city, I shared with her some of the photos I'd taken. She looked through them with genuine interest, complimenting the way I captured the light, the angles, the subtle details. There was a moment where she looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that felt more than friendship. It was a gentle, unspoken understanding, a mutual respect for each other's journeys. It was then that I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was ready to open my heart again. It wasn't about replacing the past or forgetting the pain. It was about embracing the future with someone who truly valued me, someone who saw me as I was. The thought was both scary and exhilarating, but I felt prepared. This time, I knew myself better, and I knew what I wanted and deserved. As we continued our walk, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. I didn't have everything figured out, but I was okay with that. For the first time, I was content with the journey, wherever it might lead. I was reclaiming my identity, my purpose, and my happiness, and that was enough. That quiet walk with Sarah stayed on my mind for days afterward. I kept turning over the feeling of hope and peace I'd felt with her, the sense of being understood without words. It was different from anything I'd felt before, real, steady, and entirely free of the anxieties and insecurities that had once clouded my relationship with Jenny. As weeks turned into months, Sarah and I grew closer. We kept things simple, with no labels or expectations, just enjoying each other's company and letting things evolve naturally. I didn't feel pressured to be anyone other than myself with her. She valued honesty, and her kindness was unwavering. Being around her felt like a second chance, a chance to experience connection without the weight of betrayal or hidden agendas. One evening, we met for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in town. We sat outside, sharing a bottle of wine as the evening air grew cooler. I could feel the urge to tell her everything, not just about the affair, but about the ways it had shaped me, taught me, and broken me. Up until then, I'd kept most of the details private, not wanting to taint this fresh start with the ghosts of my past. But with Sarah, I felt safe enough to let down my guard. She listened, really listened, as I told her about my marriage, the affair, and the months of struggle I'd gone through to rediscover myself. She didn't interrupt or offer cliches. She just held my hand and looked at me with such empathy that I felt like the weight of my past was finally easing. When I finished, she squeezed my hand and said, "Thank you for trusting me with this. You're stronger than you realize." In that moment, I felt a warmth and acceptance I hadn't known was possible. It wasn't just about letting someone in. It was about realizing that the right person would respect my story and understand it without judgment. I felt a deep sense of gratitude, both for her and for the journey that had brought me here. From then on, things between us grew deeper, more meaningful. It was like all the pieces I'd thought were lost in the chaos of the past were slowly coming back together, fitting into a new life I was building on my own terms. We took things slowly, savoring each moment without rushing into labels or commitments. But I knew, deep down, that I was ready for a future that included her, one that was built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. I started thinking about where I wanted my life to go, both with Sarah and independently. I made plans for my career, setting goals and pushing myself to take on projects I'd been putting off. I even started talking to my parents about the idea of visiting them more often, reconnecting with family in a way I hadn't been able to for years. As Sarah and I spent more time together, I realized that love didn't have to be complicated or fraught with doubts. It could be simple, kind, and real. For the first time, I saw a future with someone that wasn't tangled in resentment or fear. This time, I knew I could step forward with a heart that was both whole and open. With Sarah by my side, I felt like I was truly stepping into a new chapter. I'd come a long way from those dark days, and as the months turned into a year, I could see just how much I'd grown. The pain and betrayal that once defined me had faded into something else, a reminder of the strength I'd discovered in myself and of the choices I'd made to reclaim my life. One evening, Sarah and I were sitting on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the city skyline. We were quiet, comfortable in each other's presence, when she looked at me and asked, "Where do you see us in a year from now?" I thought about her question, and for the first time, I felt excitement rather than fear. I could see a future with her, one that was full of possibility and promise. But it wasn't just about being with her. It was about the life we could build together, one based on trust, respect, and the lessons we'd both learned along the way. "I see us happy," I replied. "Wherever we end up, I just want us to be happy." She smiled, reaching over to take my hand, and in that moment, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. My journey had been long, painful, and full of unexpected twists, but it had led me to a place where I could finally look forward without looking back. From that night on, Sarah and I began building a life together. It was a slow, steady process, filled with laughter, shared goals, and an unspoken understanding that we'd both come from difficult places. But that past didn't haunt us. It was just a part of the story, a foundation that made our connection even stronger. As I closed that chapter of my life, I found myself grateful, not just for Sarah, but for everything I'd been through. I'd learned the importance of honesty, the value of self-respect, and the power of moving on. And now, standing on the edge of a future I'd never expected, I felt ready to love, to live, and to embrace every new chapter that lay ahead. To anyone reading this who's gone through a similar heartbreak, I want you to know that there's hope on the other side. The journey may be hard, but with time, healing, and a commitment to yourself, you'll find your way back to happiness. Trust in your own strength, let go of what no longer serves you, and be open to the unexpected. Life has a way of surprising us, and sometimes, the best things come after the hardest goodbyes. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.